What if the chains holding you back are on the inside? What if the rules constraining what you do and say and think are ones you didn't even know you were following? In this episode, which is the biggest and most challenging one I've ever produced, we'll follow 4 different stories of people finding the courage to write their own minds. This is the story of freedom you can't see. You're listening to I Heart This. Oxford's Sheldonian Theatre was packed. People had turned out in droves to hear the new professor of political theory give his first lecture. Isaiah Berlin's reputation as a captivating orator preceded him, and that night Berlin wanted to talk about something both politically urgent and intensely personal. This was 1958. It was the depths of the Cold War. Berlin's own family had fled from the Russian Revolution when he was a child, and his friends who still lived in Russia gave Berlin unique insight into the terrors of Stalinism. That night, Berlin wanted to talk about freedom. It would become his most famous lecture, one in which Berlin outlined 2 kinds of liberty. Negative liberty, which was freedom from external coercion, from those who would stop you from speaking or gathering or going where you wanted. Positive liberty, on the other hand, was internal. Freedom from addiction, from irrational fears, from all the ways that we coerce ourselves. Winning negative liberty wasn't easy, but at least it was straightforward. When Stalin sent you to the Gulag, at least you knew who the villain was. But winning positive liberty was far less clear. The chains of belief that constrain you can be as hard to break as literal chains, but they're often invisible. How do you free yourself from chains that you can't even see? I've been obsessing over this question for weeks now. Like for Berlin, it feels both urgent and personal, both because of the challenges I've had in winning some of my own positive liberty, and because I see around me the erosion of many of the very things that allowed me to win it. Turning these thoughts into a coherent episode has not been easy. So to help, I've invited some new voices to tell 4 different stories. My own story, the story of Jane Goodall, the story of a girl raised by paranoid doomsday preppers, and the story of European missionaries sent to the Americas. Each one deals with positive liberty at a different scale, and each one casts a slightly different light on the question of how it is that we free our own minds.
Days of Abomination. Story number 1. Tara. The federal government was tracking everyone, trying to control them, and soon all of society would collapse into lawless and chaotic days of abomination. That's what Tara Westover's father said. That's why he stockpiled food, fuel, and guns. That's why Tara didn't have a birth certificate or vaccinations. Mainstream medicine was just one more way the government controlled you. So in Tara's family, even the most grievous injuries were treated with herbs and prayers. Public school was a ploy by the government to lead children away from God. Instead, Tara grew up working in her father's scrapyard, dodging heavy machinery and toxic fumes. Tara's 2018 memoir, Educated, tells the story of a childhood full of misogyny, paranoia, gaslighting, and abuse. But for young Tara, that was just how things were. That was just life. When, at 16, she took the ACT in a long-shot attempt to apply for college, she wasn't trying to escape. She just wanted a job as a church choir director. And she was nervous about it, worried that the communists there might brainwash her.
The Right Way to Live. Story number 2. Me. My own childhood was about as safe and nurturing as Tara's was dangerous. But when I was 16, I also believed that civilization was going to end. This wasn't because of my parents. It was because of a book. Tom Brown Jr. was an outdoorsman who wrote a wild mix of tall tales, old-fashioned natural history, Boy Scout skills, and homespun New Age philosophy. He claimed that he had apprenticed with an Apache tracker in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey and learned from him how to move so stealthily that he could touch a deer and how to track so well that he could follow a trail across bare rock and how to survive in the wild with nothing but a knife. As an impressionable kid, absolutely bonkers about the woods, reading Tom Brown's books was like a religious conversion. My parents were, I think, worried that I'd been taken in by a con man, but I was convinced that Tom was right, and everyone else was wrong. Wrong because their judgment had been clouded by the siren call of civilization. I read and reread every book Tom Brown published. Each one was more outrageous than the last. Until in his book, The Journey, Tom told of the Night of Red Stars, his Apache teacher's doomsday prophecy, where a night when the stars literally turned red would warn the children of the earth around the world of civilization's impending destruction, and only those who returned to the old ways in the deepest wilderness would survive. I read this just at the age where everyone was asking what I wanted to do with my life. They, of course, wanted to hear about my career goals. But I didn't want a job. I didn't want to be a productive member of the economy. The economy was destroying the friggin' planet. You want to know what I wanted to do with my life? I wanted to go live in the woods. My parents wanted me to go to college, and I railed against them. But as high school graduation got closer, I was running out of options because I was not ready for the Night of Red Stars. I still couldn't touch a single deer or track anything across bare rock. I was basically just a halfway decent camper. So when I capitulated to the college plan, I, like Tara, was fearful of getting caught by the system, and I told myself that college was just a postponement. It was the time I needed to sharpen my skills and plan my escape.
The world of late medieval Europe was one of near-perfect symmetry. All power flowed from God, through the kings and popes who ruled by divine right to the cardinals and dukes, and on to counts and bishops and so on. Each level held dominion over the one below and owed fealty to the one above, all the way down to the peasant in his hovel, who, even still, held dominion over his wife. It might sound like Orwellian doublespeak today, but in late medieval Europe, freedom was obedience. You became free by being a servant. Freedom from sin came from service to God. Salvation came from accepting your sinful nature, knowing your place, and submitting to your lieges, both heavenly and worldly. Worldly lords desired new lands and new markets. The heavenly one desired new souls. So when Columbus blundered into the Americas, both churches and kings sent out their vassals. It's hard to say what they expected to find, but it almost certainly wasn't upending the divine authority of their masters. Nor did Jane Goodall expect to upend anything.
Leaving Humankind. Story 4. Jane. In March of 1957, a young secretary named Jane Goodall boarded a passenger steamship bound for Kenya. For Jane, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. She had loved animals from the day she was born, but Africa did not disappoint her. But if she wanted to stay in Africa, she needed a job. So Jane took a secretarial job with an anthropologist investigating human evolution, a man named Louis Leakey. Louis was impressed by Jane's encyclopedic knowledge of wildlife. Soon Jane was joining Louis's team in their excavations. Sharp, strong, and fearless, and comfortable with being alone, Jane made quite an impression. She had the perfect qualifications for another job that Louis had in mind. To augment his out-of-Africa theory of human origins, Louis was spearheading a long-term study of humans' closest relatives, chimpanzees. In Leakey's eyes, the fact that Jane had no formal scientific training was just another qualification. Her mind was full of passion and uncluttered by theory. And so, at 26, even without a bachelor's degree, Jane set out for the jungle.
None of the people in these stories could guess how leaving home would change them. And really, why should they? Why should someone change just because they stand in some different scenery? Are we really made of such flimsy stuff that all it takes to change who we are is to put us in a room with some strangers in funny costumes? But even so, I think there's some part of us that knows that this kind of change is possible. We get this creeping feeling that we don't have the whole story. It's a feeling that most of us ignore until we sit down at an expensive restaurant with an unsettlingly long lineup of spoons. Or we go to a religious service where we don't know the script and end up sitting in the pews when we're supposed to kneel. Why is it that leaving the comfortable world we know changes who we are?
Those without sin. The missionaries evangelized to thousands of Indian peoples, but despite the vast differences in language and customs of their would-be converts, the missionaries ran into the same problem over and over again. Indians had little use for Christian redemption because as far as the Indians were concerned, they had nothing to be saved from. Missionaries across the Americas complained about this. They would urge the Indians to acknowledge their state of sin, and the Indians would look at each other and say, "Acknowledge what? We haven't done anything wrong." For the missionaries, sin wasn't just something you did. You were born in sin, conceived in sin. You sinned not just in actions, but in thoughts and feelings. And the missionaries who tried to explain this were met with incredulity. What even is a sinful thought? Mostly, I just think about where I want to go, or whether I could trade my robe for a nice new kettle. The threat of hell and the promise of heaven were met with similar skepticism. Many chafed at how heaven was so European. Why would I want to go there? I wouldn't know anyone. And it'll be full of French people. Others were turned off by the idea of having to spend eternity in a place with no farms, no tobacco, no trading, no gambling, and no sex. Just exactly how did one spend one's time in this supposed paradise? "I am content to be damned," one man proclaimed. But sin and damnation weren't the only ideas the Indians balked at. The nations of northeastern North America lived with little regard for the fundamental underpinnings of the European social order. There were whole languages which had no word for king. As one colonial official wrote of the Iroquois, they allow no kind of superiority of one over another, and banish all servitude from their territories. Another missionary said, "From the beginning of the world to the coming of the French, the savages have never known what it was to forbid anything. They are a free people, each of whom considers himself as much consequence of the others, and they submit to their chiefs only insofar as it pleases them." This was profoundly troubling to the missionaries. Their whole cosmos was based on obedience. You can hear the exasperation in their writings. "I do not believe that there is any people on earth freer than they, and less able to allow the subjugation of their wills to any power whatever. So much so that fathers here have no control over their children, or captains over their subjects, or the laws of the country over any of them." For their part, the Indians were equally mystified and equally critical of the French. As one irritated priest reported, the Micmac were constantly criticizing the French for being greedy, quarrelsome, and unkind. "Look at us," the Micmac said. "We live peaceably. We share what we have. You might have more stuff, but we are richer, for we have ease and comfort and time." Some members of the Montagne Naskapi considered their French neighbors little better than slaves, living in constant terror of their superiors. In all of these encounters with each other, both missionaries and Indians began to see themselves. Missionaries began to articulate what was unspoken about authority. And among the Indians, whole nations that had taken freedom so for granted that they didn't even have a word for it, began to see it in themselves for the first time.
Jane was an outsider. Not only was she young, not only was she a woman, not only did she have little scientific training, she was also working in a field of little scientific consequence. Research followed the money, and there was no money to be made by animal behavior. No matter how novel the discovery, in a world where people were unraveling the secrets of DNA, the study of actual animals was regarded as something quaint, like Victorian children catching butterflies or pressing wildflowers. But however, Jane was an outsider to scientific establishment. It was nothing compared to how much of an outsider she was to chimpanzees. Today, most of us remember Jane holding their hands, letting them groom her hair, but those photos were taken years into her study. At the beginning, Jane sat alone in the jungle, hoping just to catch a glimpse of them. Her whole research facility was a tent and pit toilet. Her whole research team was herself, a notebook, and a barely adequate pair of binoculars. She was constantly pulling thorns out of her skin, her clothes. She got sick. She was plagued by tsetse flies. There weren't even maps of the jungle she was living in. She constantly worried that without some kind of discovery, the whole program would get shut down. 4 months in, no discovery had come. Then she found David Greybeard. David was a chimp who seemed almost as curious about her as she was of him. It was David who, as Jane watched, plucked the leaves off a twig and used it to fish termites out of a nearby mound. It was the first time that anyone had systematically recorded a non-human creature using a tool. Jane would eventually discover that chimpanzees went to war, grieved their dead, negotiated political power, and made friends. This is common knowledge now, but when Jane first observed them in the jungle at 26 years old, wondering if her research would get cancelled, these things seemed impossible. Humans were humans and chimps were animals. Animals didn't do those things. Those things required learning and society and culture. In light of what Jane found, what did it mean to be human?
Hidden history. By some miracle, Tara passed the ACT. So, in 2004, at 17, she stepped into her first class. Not just her first class at Brigham Young University, but her first academic class ever. The Gentiles around her, with their casual dress and their ibuprofen, might as well have been from Mars. Tara's account of her first year at school is full of conflict, wonder and disbelief, liberation and guilt, curiosity and skepticism. She drove herself to exhaustion with shift work, trying to make ends meet, until a mentor basically dragged her through the application for a Pell Grant. A friend gently insisted that she take some pills for the pain of an earache, drugs she feared would never leave her body, and rot her slowly from the inside for the rest of her life. 20 minutes later, when the pain was gone, she couldn't understand. She swung her head from left to right, trying to jog the pain loose again. In an art history class one day, Tara raised her hand to ask about an unfamiliar word. For reasons she couldn't understand, her classmates and professor recoiled without even dignifying her question with an answer. So, after class, she went to the computer lab to look the word up herself. The word was Holocaust. She wrote, "I don't know how long I sat there reading about it, but at some point I'd read enough. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I suppose I was in shock, but whether it was the shock of learning about something horrific or the shock of learning about my own ignorance, I'm not sure. I do remember imagining for a moment, not the camps, not the pits or chambers of gas, but my mother's face. A wave of emotion took me, a feeling so intense, so unfamiliar, I wasn't sure what it was. It made me want to shout at her." Tara's problem wasn't just ignorance. It was the ignorance of her ignorance. What else had her parents not told her? When would she run headlong into an invisible fence that had been erected in her own mind?
My story. The Emperor's New Clothes. The fences in my mind were ones that I had built myself. You see, Tom Brown's stories weren't the only ones I had turned into scripture. There was always some kind of guidebook to life that I was referencing. When I was young, it was literal scripture, like the rules of the Catholic Church. And I went through a phase where I decided that I would practice them until I leveled up to sainthood. As a teen, I decided I wasn't a Catholic anymore, and I went creed shopping for anything that promised a step-by-step approach to enlightenment. I tried shamanic journeys and creative visualization. I read the Course in Miracles and a whole bunch of ancient yogic texts. All I had to do was find the right recipe and follow the directions, and then life would be only robust health and unflappable joy. I thought that during college I would just refine my method, practice my survival skills, do my yoga, visualize breathing in the light for 3 10-minute sessions every day, and then I'd have it all. But things didn't work out that way. College was full of ideas, but woefully short on recipes. I thought that Tom Brown wrote with the authority of a prophet, and the yogic texts had been channeled by ascended masters. But scientists and historians and philosophers, they equivocated and contradicted each other all over the place and left all kinds of unanswered questions. And the more I read, the harder it was to say who was right. And talking about things in class only made it worse. Everyone around me was so smart. And they weren't unkind about it, but they cut my ideas to shreds. Once, when we had our human ecology seminar down on the pier, I announced with confidence that the world would be better off without personal property, and my professor grabbed my backpack with an impish grin and held it out over the waters of the bay and said, "Well, you won't mind then if I just drop this overboard, would you?" And another time, I spent a late night in the dining hall telling my friend Steve that technology was the problem. It was what had led us away from the earth, away from our natural place in the order of things. But as we talked into the morning, he had me admitting that, yeah, sharpened stones and bows and arrows were just as much a kind of technology as a computer, and grudgingly admitting that other technologies, like the printed word, were undeniably beautiful. Every direction I turned, my dogmas were cut to shreds, and I was left to gather the pieces and try to stitch my cookbook recipe to life back together again. In my senior year, I discovered the reserve reading of a cultural anthropology course, and I was captivated. Did you know that the native people of the Canary Islands had a language that was whistled? That the Fong of Gabon believed that people have 7 separate souls, that there are members of some northern Canadian cultures that contract a mental illness that no others in the world seem to. This overpowering compulsion to cannibalize. In Vanuatu, men prove their masculinity by leaping, vines tied to their ankles, from towers almost 100 feet high made entirely of sticks. Some cultures kill any woman who is pregnant out of wedlock. Others look for premarital children as a kind of test run on fertility. People in some cultures hoard wealth, others share everything. Still others brave wild voyages across the open sea in canoes to exchange bracelets and necklaces with no particular value on some faraway island. Against that backdrop of the full breadth of human culture, I had to concede 2 things. 1, my people's ways were as strange as any other tribes. They just didn't seem that way because they were familiar to me. And 2, there was nothing that seemed like a right method in all of it, not even among the hunters and gatherers who I considered to be the children of the earth. After reading those books, I felt like I was seeing myself clearly for the first time. There were all these invisible rules that governed how I looked for love or treated strangers, and how I worked and how I ate and how I dressed. Some were taught, like don't eat with your elbows on the table, and others I just seemed to breathe in with the air, like don't make eye contact on the subway. These invisible rules constrained what I thought and believed, even the questions I could ask. And in the bombardment of all those different perspectives and the radical intellectual tolerance of college, I realized for the first time how I had been looking for some right way to live. It was something I only saw because so many other people didn't even seem to consider that there was a right way to live. What happens when we leave home and go on that journey? When we cross the ocean? When we head out to Gombe to hang with the chimpanzees? Why does that journey change us? I think it's this. To finally see ourselves, we have to look through other people's eyes. That's why missionaries and Indians saw their own hidden assumptions about authority and power only after they encountered each other. That's why the world came face to face with the assumption that human culture was unique only after Jane helped us see ourselves through the eyes of our closest relatives. And that is why, I think, when Tara first learned about the Holocaust, she didn't just think about the gas chambers. She thought about her mom.
Wicked liberty. What does looking in the mirror like that do to us? Well, for one thing, it can be hella uncomfortable. You feel it in the missionary's writing. In the words of one Jesuit, the wicked liberty of the savages is the greatest impediment to their submitting to the yoke of the law of God. These comments might seem backwards to modern ears, but I think I understand them. Authority was what they'd built their lives on. It was sacred. Churches and kings were a direct line to God. This was their purpose. This was what gave their lives meaning. To consider life without it wasn't just a threat to their sense of self. It was a threat to the entire world. And so the missionaries grasped all the tighter to their mission. To bring salvation, they would teach the Indians that they were tainted by sin and could only be saved by submitting to God. In their efforts to extend salvation, the missionaries became the serpent in the garden, convincing converts to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, just so that they could save them from it again.
Fool's gold. Tara also struggled with confronting the unconscious assumptions from which her world was built. But she was stuck code-switching, moving from BYU during the semester to her family's home in Idaho during her breaks. But increasingly she felt she didn't belong in either. Studying abroad in Cambridge, one professor saw the conflict and tried to affirm that she did, in fact, belong there. "You are not fool's gold," he told her, shining only under a particular light. "You are gold, and returning to BYU, or even the mountain you came from, will not change who you are." Tara wanted to believe him, but dressing and acting like a Cambridge scholar weren't going to make her one. Clothes could not fix what was wrong with her. But beneath the clothes, Tara was changing. When her father would testify to how Jewish bankers had instigated World War II because they stood to benefit from the disaster, she found herself astonished that she had once believed this kind of thing. When a devout friend expressed doubts about the Mormon doctrines of polygamy, instead of trying to reaffirm his faith, she realized that she had no faith to reaffirm, just a conviction that even in the afterlife, she would never be a plural wife, even if God himself commanded it. She wasn't a scholar. She was no longer a faithful Mormon. Who was she?
Names instead of numbers. Jane Goodall's work instigated an identity crisis of a completely different kind. Not just for herself or for her society, but for an entire species. Jane got to know each individual of that little band of chimps. She gave them names, she earned their trust, she became their friends. She noticed when they got jealous, curious. She noticed their tenderness, their rivalries, and their affection. Her methods were more like those of an ethnographer, studying the customs of a society, than a biologist, quantifying behavior. In doing so, James stepped outside of her own cultural game farther than most anyone ever has. And what was so striking was not the differences, but how much we shared in common. Through Jane's eyes, we came to see that culture itself is older than humankind. Follow any custom back in time, from grandmother to grandmother, and its roots will converge in an ancient culture that we share with all humans and all chimpanzees. The identity crisis instigated by Jane's work was felt not just by Jane, but by the whole intellectual tradition of Western culture. In the light of her work, what even makes us human? Not tools, not technology, not emotion, not personality, not even culture. Chimps did all of that, as much as any forest tribe or modern-day New Yorker. Was there even a line between human and animal at all? As Louis Leakey said when he heard the news, now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human.
In college, I was also being forced to redefine what things meant. But it was a redefinition that I resisted. Just because the cosmopolitan spirit of college tore apart every self-assured creed I had, didn't mean I stopped trying to find the right one. Mostly I tried to buttress the ones that I had, to resolve them against each other, to force them to fit together. I even did a whole semester-long study in which I tried to rationally justify why the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and the philosophy of Tom Brown were perfectly congruent. It was like jamming two unmatched jigsaw puzzle pieces together. But they didn't stop me from trying. Nevertheless, the jagged edges of my fundamentalism began to erode. As graduation approached, I realized that even after years of practice, I wasn't ready for civilization to end. I still couldn't live off the land. If the night of the red stars came, no matter how pure my intentions, I just wouldn't be able to hack it. And my studies in college drove home the fact that societal and environmental breakdown wasn't some kind of abstraction. It was something that had actually happened over and over again through history, causing untold misery and suffering. And I began to imagine what that would mean for the people that I cared about, for my mom and dad and my brother and sister. If civilization really did end, would they starve? Would they die? Would they be punished for the sins of all humanity? How could I hope for something like that? But it was in graduate school where the whole thing finally fell apart. I was studying science, not just the facts and ideas of scientific knowledge, but the process, peer review and skepticism and empirical testing and the appeal to evidence, the things that make science tick, and was wreaking havoc with my attempts to resolve the right way to live. And one sunny afternoon in the university parking lot, my friend and fellow science majors were talking about getting a Reiki treatment. And I thought, this is it. This is exactly what I'm wrestling with. And so I asked her how she made sense of her energy healing in the face of the science that we'd just been learning. And she laughed nervously and said, well, I just think about them with a separate part of my brain. I think about these things scientifically and these things not so much. And I realized that I didn't have separate sections in my brain. Something was real or it wasn't. Something was true or it wasn't. And in the face of a complete lack of evidence for an energy body, I watched yoga crumble like sand between my fingers. What happens to us in the dissonance of seeing ourselves in somebody else's eyes? I guess a lot of different things could happen. We could cling to our old ideas like the missionaries. We could let them go, intentionally or not, like I let go of yoga. We could try and live in two worlds at once like Tara did. But no matter what we do, there is no escape from the crisis. That's why we call it culture shock. When we see that there is no foundation under all of our assumptions, we are left with no ground to stand on. wondering who we are, wondering if we belong anywhere. So why put ourselves through all of that? If culture shock is so alienating, why not avoid it? Why not stay where you know who you are? Why not stay where the world makes sense?
Columbian Exchange. Jesuits may have continued waving their Bibles and denying that they had anything to learn from the American savages. But their writings, read widely throughout Europe, exposed a whole continent to new ideas of freedom. Indian diplomats engaged in spirited debate with European writers and thinkers. And unlike the missionaries, many of these writers and thinkers listened. Over the next decades, these debates spread through salons and drawing rooms to influence the likes of Voltaire and Rousseau, Spinoza, Locke, and Thomas Paine. The Indian societies of northeastern North America were undeniable evidence that the divine right of kings and lords was not the inevitable natural state of human society. The Enlightenment ideals of liberty, self-governance, democracy, and human rights owe their origins, at least in part, to this Columbian Exchange. It is no surprise that it was an American document that first declared that rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were self-evident. Nor is it a surprise that it was in France, the colonial power who interacted most with those nations, that demands for liberté, égalité, fraternité brought 1,000 years of royal power to an end.
Louis Leakey helped arrange for Jane to get a Ph.D., and so, like Tara, Jane found herself at Cambridge. For several years, Jane split her time between England and Gowdy. But it wasn't easy, and there were times when Jane feared she'd made a mistake. I was reprimanded at Cambridge for ascribing personalities to different chimpanzees. Only humans have personalities, I was told. Nor should I have been talking about the chimpanzee mind. Only humans, said the scientists, were capable of rational thought. Talking of chimpanzee emotions was the very worst of my anthropomorphic sins. For Jane's professors at Cambridge, data should be clinical, stripped of judgment and inference. Instead of narratives, they wanted a checklist instead of stories. They wanted graphs. Jane adopted some of those approaches, but she was intractable about others. She was now the world's foremost expert on chimpanzee behavior, and she knew it. She knew what she had seen. In truth, Jane's professors had a point. We could never know the inner lives of other creatures. There was no way to observe them directly. We couldn't assume that they felt anger or grief or joy the way we did. It would be too easy to fool ourselves, to paint the world in our own image. The problem was that the methods also made us blind. We were so afraid of assuming that other creatures might have emotions like ours, that we ended up assuming that they didn't have emotional lives at all. Instead of seeing animals in our own image, we excised the animal from ourselves. We were something different, something special. We alone had intelligence, culture, and heart. But because of Jane and David Greybeard and all the other chimps, this kind of chauvinism just couldn't hold. Not even in the antiseptic calls of Cambridge science. Humans didn't just evolve from animals. We were animals. Any line between us was just one we had made up. Disabused of the idea of our own uniqueness, we were humbler. But we were also free to explore our place in the family of life and to appreciate the minds and hearts of our fellow mortals. Because of Jane, there's now a whole field of animal behavior that investigates the inner lives of other creatures. We have seen birds and octopuses solve problems. We have watched elephants bury their dead. We have watched whale songs go in and out of fashion. We still can't assume that these inner lives are anything like our own, but we can no longer deny they exist. Jane changed how we do that science. She changed how we saw ourselves. We are not alone in the universe. There are other intelligences right here on planet Earth.
Tara's realization. In Cambridge, Tara chose to study historiography, the study of not history but historians. She writes, I suppose my interest came from the sense of groundlessness I'd felt since learning about the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement. Since realizing that what a person knows about the past is limited and will always be limited to what they are told by others, now I needed to understand how the great gatekeepers of history had come to terms with their own ignorance and partiality. I thought if I could accept that what they had written was not absolute, but was the result of a biased process of conversation and revision, maybe I could reconcile myself with the fact that the history most people agreed upon was not the history I had been taught. Dad could be wrong, and the great historians, Carlyle, Macaulay, and Trevelyan, could be wrong, but from the ashes of their dispute, I could construct a world to live in. And knowing there was no ground at all, I hoped that I could stand on it. After graduation, Tara followed this thread through graduate studies. She learned about feminism and about Isaiah Berlin's two kinds of freedom. She went on a visiting fellowship to Harvard and read Molly Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill. The gulf between her and her family grew wider. Her brother grew ever more violent, and when she asked her parents to confront him, her father basically excommunicated her from the family. Finally, her parents came to her at Harvard, stayed in her dorm room for a week, urged her to repent, offered her one last chance to reaffirm her belief and rejoin the family. And Tara realized that she couldn't. Everything I had worked for, all my years of study, had been to purchase for myself this one privilege: to see and experience more truths than those given to me by my father, and to use those truths to construct my own mind. I had come to believe that the ability to evaluate many ideas, many histories, many points of view was at the heart of what it means to self-create. If I yielded now, I would lose more than an argument. I would lose custody of my own mind. This was the price I was being asked to pay. I understood that now. What my father wanted to cast from me wasn't a demon. It was me. This is what Tara thought as her dad offered her one last chance to rejoin her family. And she refused.
Setting us free. Yes, by definition, culture shock is alienating, but it also has the power to set us free. When we loosen our grasp on the rules of our game and question truths that we've always accepted, we earn this rare moment to think for ourselves. When I stood in the university parking lot and felt the one right way of living crumble through my fingers, I felt so lost. Because if there was no right way to live, then how was I supposed to find my way? I wish I could say I had some great epiphany about this, but it wasn't like that. I kept going to school, kept hanging out with my friends. I got on with my life, and eventually I just got used to the idea. And life without a clear guidebook turned out to be okay. I mean, in fact, it felt kind of good. Because if there was no right way to live, then I was free to find my own. And I think that the reason that I hadn't granted myself that freedom was because I didn't want the responsibility. It was easier to outsource right and wrong to someone else than it was to investigate my own conscience. To admit that there might not be a right answer was to accept that I would have to make my own choices, and no sage or scripture was ever going to bail me out. I began this episode by asking, how do we achieve the positive liberty that Isaiah Berlin described? Or in the words of another political philosopher, how do we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? Berlin's lecture was a warning about the dangers of being too certain in your beliefs. of trusting too much in your assumptions. He said that there is no one true way to be free, that in a plural society, people will want many, often irreconcilable freedoms, and that as confounding as that can be, we are the richer for it. Winning custody of your own mind isn't easy. There will always be people like Tara's parents who want to protect us from falling off the one true path. They would censor what we would learn and silence what we would say. However genuinely they care for us, they make our world smaller. But there are even more formidable forces to reckon with inside of us. The fear, prejudice, addiction, stubbornness. Bob Marley said that no one but ourselves can free our minds, and that's certainly true. We win our freedom of thought through courage and open-mindedness and humility. But with all due respect, Bob, that's not the whole story. I didn't just free myself. Tara didn't just free herself. Not by ourselves anyway. None of us do. None of us can. In all of these stories, at every level, from the personal to the political to the existential, we needed other people, sometimes actually non-human people, to show us our own mental chains. And this usually wasn't our loved ones, wasn't our neighbors or our friends or our families. In every case, it was the strangest of strangers, people who acted and thought and believed differently than we did. They were the ones that were able to show us who we are. To the extent that I have had the courage to let go of old ideas, it was because there were people who both challenged me and nurtured me. I have had so many wise teachers. There were the literal teachers and professors who sometimes playfully, sometimes harshly challenged my beliefs. But just as often, they were strangers, people I met while traveling, fellow students who argued with me in class, and eventually one day, students of my own who asked me questions that I hadn't yet dared to ask myself. There were writers like Daniel Quinn, whose book made me so angry that I threw it across the room more than once. And there were writers like Tara Westover and people like Jane Goodall, who modeled for me how to keep my mind and heart open, even when it felt like I wouldn't survive the changes. Most of these people I've never thanked, despite the enormous debt that I owe them. Often I didn't know what they'd done for me until long after they'd left my life. This is a debt that I will never be able to pay back. And this is, at last, why I think I've written my way through this essay in the first place. Because I can recognize and acknowledge and appreciate the gift. Most of these people will never even know what they've done for me. And if I cannot tell them, at least I can tell you. I am so grateful. My life would be so much smaller without them. And I know I'm not alone. Someone else out there listening has learned who you were because somebody else saw you. Somebody else showed you how you were bound on the inside and told you that you were strong enough to break yourself free. Somebody else out there trusted you enough to write your own mind, even when they could see that you were totally screwing it up. And they let you. And they said that you were clever enough to figure it out for yourself. And they celebrated you when somehow, miraculously, you did. Maybe none but ourselves can free our minds. But we live in a world where people fight every day, despite demagogues and internet echo chambers and propaganda and book banning, to make sure that people have the tools to set themselves free. This is a world where librarians hold their ground when people shout that kids can't handle those books. This is the world where school teachers and professors push students to think beyond what is comfortable. This is a world where scientists patiently report the data even when it is inconvenient and uncomfortable. We are free on the inside because of each other. My friends, I know you've waited a long time for this episode. I hope it was worth the wait. I Heart This is changing. I'll still be making episodes, but it's going to be less often. And that's so I can make room for a new project. I love new projects. This one is one that I've been dreaming of for years. A science YouTube channel called Progressively Less Wrong. A place where we take a second look at the old truisms that you might have heard in a high school science class and ask, well, how do we know that? How do we know the Earth is a mantle? Or that there are neutrons in a nucleus? Or that the mitochondrion is the powerhouse of the cell? There is plenty out there on YouTube for science nerds, but nothing quite like the mix of history and wonder and storytelling that Progressively Less Wrong is going to be. Whether or not you think of yourself as a science person, if you like what we do here on I Heart This, I think you'll love what we do on Progressively Less Wrong. But even though I Heart This might be producing fewer episodes, that doesn't mean I'm any less committed to the mission of making the world a kinder, more curious, more appreciative place. If that's a mission you believe in, the best way to support it is to share I Heart This with someone you love. I Heart This is written, edited, and produced by me, Ben Lord. Our logo was designed by Brian E. Morrow-Cribbs. Our website is iheartthispodcast.com. You can find all of our sources in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember to be kind and curious and thankful.